Welcome to Dialogues at Fulcrum, where we have conversations with experts and analysts on the latest geopolitical, economic, and cultural developments in Southeast Asia.
Hello and welcome to this Dialogues at Fulcrum podcast. Fulcrum is the opinion and commentary forum of the ICS Yusof Ishak Institute. I am Lee Ho-an, a senior fellow at ICS, co-coordinator of the Malaysia Studies program, and one of the Fulcrum editors.
And I am Francis Hutchinson, also a senior fellow at ICES and coordinator of the Malaysia Studies program. Let me introduce our guest for today. Liew Chin Tong is the Deputy Minister of Investment, Trade and Industry and has also served as Deputy Defense Minister from July 2018 to February 2020. He is a long-standing member of the Democratic Action Party, a three-time member of Parliament, sitting member of the Johor State Assembly, and he has also served as a senator in the Dewan Negara. Among his many accomplishments, Chin Tong has been a visiting research fellow with us on 2 occasions. And of course, he is a prolific writer with his most recent book entitled Second Takeoff Strategies for Malaysia's Economic Resurgence, published last year. So, Chin Tong, you're visiting Singapore today, a country that turns 60 this year and that is often compared to Malaysia given their shared history and similar export-oriented economic models. What comes to mind first and foremost as you think about the two countries' economic and political trajectories?
Thank you, Francis. Thank you, Hwan. It's great to come back to ISIS. I was here in 2006 and I was a non-resident fellow during COVID. I think Malaysia and Singapore has now come to a historic juncture of global economy. As you pointed out, both Malaysia and Singapore had taken the export-led industrialization strategy over the last 50 odd years. But now that US is warring itself out, and export-led industrialization strategy presupposes US as the consumer of the last resort, and in many instances, consumer of the first resort. What do Malaysia and Singapore do? And what do ASEAN do after this? So I think it's time for us to think of new way of integrating our economies. And between Malaysia and Singapore, uh, we have signed the Johor Singapore Special Economic Zone agreement. We're trying to make it happen in a way that benefit both sides, and hopefully, this will be a good start for the next era. And I hope in the long run, Malaysia and Singapore will create not just an economic zone, but will together create many Malaysian and Singapore companies that are of regional, if not global, consequences or relevance, and through which we drive the growth of ASEAN.
Chin Tong, we have known each other personally for some years now, and I have followed your political career. And I would observe that you have espoused positive politics throughout your career. Even in opposition, you consistently focused on policies, reforms, and constructive contributions. And it's safe to say that you are an optimist and a strategist. I recall your leadership of the DAP's bold electoral moves into Johor since 12 years ago, which has now secured the party some footholds in the state. And your generally unperturbable disposition, even through the turbulence of Malaysian politics. Of course, while you have been in federal government and holding cabinet posts, as Francis said just now, 2018 to 2020, and then 2022 to the present, you have a duty to promote policies and to project hope. But you're also a technocrat who is mindful of economic realities and administrative constraints. Now, before we dive deeper into Malaysia's investment and manufacturing sector and policy challenges, could you share your policy approach and recent experience at a more fundamental level? I mean, how do you craft policy and secure buy-in? What is the mood in Malaysia towards ambitious agendas, especially the new Industrial Master Plan 2030? Do you rally stakeholders and the public around lofty aspirations? Or is it more effective to be modest and tempered, especially when the tenure of coalition governments is uncertain these days?
Uh, I first met you in 1999. It's been a while, and I've also followed your career and read your papers and writings. I'm glad that we are sitting here and chat about the future. Malaysia has been in global newspaper for the wrong reason for at least a decade, especially from around 2012, 2013, and probably the worst year was 2014 when the two aircraft fell. Um, Malaysia went into global news for the wrong reason, and Malaysians have become quite cynical of a lot of things. But if you take a longer view of history, politically at least, from where from when Anwar was put into prison in September 1998 to where we are now, it has been a miracle. And I joined the DAP in 2000. The last 25 years has been transformative in Malaysian politics. So I take this attitude that we are able to shape our destiny to a certain extent, understanding all the challenges, understanding that sometimes we have to be patient, understanding that we cannot accomplish everything overnight. But the trajectory, I think we're on the right track. Now, in the last year or so, especially since 2023, 2024, Malaysia has been in the regional and global news for the right reasons quite often. The mood is interesting, especially if you talk to investors. They are looking at Malaysia, and not just foreign investors, domestic investors as well. Many are looking at Malaysia and the region in different light. Because when China joined the WTO in 2001, up until COVID in 2020, there was a period of time that China was a factory for the world. Therefore, there was not much relevance of Malaysians' capability. But today, because we are now in a different world altogether, from just in time, we're now talking about just in case. From efficiency, today the buzzword is resilience. So the framing of how we see the world has changed. And therefore, because we are no longer talking about a single global supply chain, we are now talking about multiple regional supply chain underpinned by geopolitics. Malaysia becomes relevant. So in this context, over the last 2 years, you can see that Malaysia become relevant on the mind of many investors domestically and globally. I published a book with the title of Second Takeoff. The first takeoff happened between 1988 and 1997. 1988, what happened? Yeah. 1988, because of the Plaza Accord in 1985, when the United States forced Japan to appreciate yen, and by 1988, it was really too expensive to export from Japan. Japanese firms, together with their Taiwanese and South Korean suppliers, moved their operations to Singapore, Batam, Malaysia, Thailand, and that propelled the first takeoff. That ended with the Asian financial crisis in 1997, and more importantly, that whole relocation ended in China when China joined the WTO in 2001. So we are seeing a turnaround of events, and broadly, I think Malaysia will continue to be relevant, and potentially, if we get our act together, we'll see a second takeoff.
So, segueing on that, in your book, The Second Takeoff, you state that few countries get a second chance. So, we've talked a little bit about the first period of the first takeoff, and you've painted a very good picture of the wider framework or context within which Malaysia is potentially getting ready to take off a second time. But let's turn our sights inside Malaysia. Let's look inside. And so, yes, geopolitics has opened up other opportunities, But have there been any lessons learned from the first time? Is there anything domestically within Malaysia that is different this time that could mean that the domestic and the external come together and really propel Malaysia forward?
The first time, or since a long, long time, particularly Malaysian policymakers and businesses thought that Malaysia is a trading nation. And because the framing is such that we thought that we are a trading nation, we were trading anything. There's a lot of trading of land and economic prosperity built upon wealth coming from land. I give an example. So among this, what they call in this whole discussions about relocation of global supply chain, many Malaysian businesses focusing on selling industrial land. But what is important, I think, the lesson that we have to learn from the first round is really we must not just think about land, we must not just think about real estate. We must ensure that it's not going to be a bubble. While on another hand, we must start seeing ourselves not necessarily as a trading nation, but as a technology nation. Malaysia will have to start to be very serious about technology. If we see ourselves as a technology nation, then the whole point is not about attracting FDI per se. It is about attracting technology, and it is about acquiring technology, and it's about eventually innovating technology. Now, if we can see Malaysia and especially this opportunity of global shift and be very clear that the objective is to make Malaysia a technology nation, then I think this round we'll see Malaysia really move up the ladder. Malaysia is stuck in some of this old mindset. So we will have been too dependent, especially after the 90s. We have been too dependent on unskilled foreign labor. We have been stuck in low productivity, low wage, and low growth vicious cycle. And in this vicious cycle, wages were determined in Singapore and Bangladesh. There are 1.1 million Malaysians working as foreign workers in Singapore, and Malaysia hired 2 over million of labor from Bangladesh. But if we are serious about technology nation, if we're serious about acquiring technology and take this opportunity of global shift and global, especially the space created for South Asia in global within this framework of global tension, we should be really thinking of moving away from a vicious cycle to a virtuous cycle of pursuing higher productivity, higher investment, higher wages, and better technology.
Just wanted to expand a bit more on this global context. We are speaking on 3rd of July. This is 5 days before the 90-day pause on President Trump's so-called reciprocal tariffs or the full reciprocal tariffs, which for Malaysia is 24%. There's still across the board 10%. Malaysia's the semiconductor exemption has been quite a relief for Malaysia. And then there's these other developments like President Xi making the high-profile visit to Malaysia as part of a Southeast Asia tour with Vietnam and Cambodia. You also have Malaysia as the ASEAN chair in 2025, emphasizing neutrality and projecting ASEAN centrality and cohesion. So there is global conditions. Still, the world is enveloped in these uncertainties, and the Trump administration is defined by its chaos and unpredictability. And there are many questions that can be asked, but let's just zoom in on two. I mean, there is real flux and instability. Right? Do you see this as helping, or how actually would it help? I suppose you've already said that it's kind of there are opportunities there, but in what ways does it actually help Malaysia's industrial transformation? And despite the formal diplomatic stance of neutrality, is Malaysia leaning toward China, both in a pragmatic sense and politically, in a pragmatic way that China is playing leading role in the green economy, whereas the US, has taken a shift back to fossil fuels.
Immediately, what is before us is that we have to deal with the shock and uncertainty as a result of the Trump tariff. Whichever the level of tariff, the new rate, this has introduced a shock to the system. And we will also have to deal with the second order effect. There are actually reciprocal tariff. There are also 301, which the semiconductor is subjected to, and there's 232, of which steel and aluminiums belongs to. We are already seeing some second order effect in the steel and aluminium sector because tariff is at 50% in the United States now. Some of the steels that were previously destined for the United States market has now come to other parts of the world. And it's not just Chinese. Uh, for instance, some of the HS code, some of the items we see that there are influx of Chinese, Korean, Japan, Indonesian steel, or Vietnam steel in different product category into Malaysia as part of the second order effect. So these are the immediate challenges that we have to deal with. But beyond this, I think we have to now deal with the questions of what's next. I've been asking friends to reflect upon this. As I asked them, what do you remember 2005 and what do you do in 2005? Particularly for Singapore businesses, I say you remember very likely a Singaporean businessman back in 2005 would be spending a couple of months in China back then because at that point of time, China was heavily invested in the industrial growth in China. Singapore businessmen were heavily invested in the industrial growth in China, and China was a factory for the world at that point of time. So we are now in 2025. For those who are old enough, they could remember what happened in the last 20 years. It is time for us to imagine what will happen in the next 20 years. 2025 is probably a dividing line. The old order is ending. We have to shape the new order. What will be a new order? I think a new order will be one that we each of us will put a lot more emphasis on regional collaboration at the ASEAN level and also at the Malaysia Singapore level, as well as Malaysia Singapore Indonesia. I think these are we'll now look at each other in a different light. We will need each other a lot more because previously when China was a factory for the world and we assumed that container boxes could be moved around without any hindrance, with no war, with no geopolitical tension, that assumption no longer works. We are now looking at multiple supply chains. And let's think about where we situate and how we see ourselves. Perhaps we should see Malaysia and ASEAN in three middles. The first middle is that Malaysia and ASEAN should position itself as the indispensable middle in technology. That means we don't necessarily have to chase the highest technology, and we accept that most likely in the next 15, 20 years, China, Japan, Korea, US, Germany, maybe France or the Netherlands would have more sophisticated technology compared to us. But as long as we are the indispensable middle in the technological realm, we are relevant. And we can produce technology for the bottom billions of the world. We can continue to be relevant trading with everyone. The second middle is we should firmly put ourselves in the middle of geopolitics. We want to be the middle ground in geopolitics. We want to ensure that we are not forced to choose, not just in geopolitics, but also in geoeconomics and in technology. What worries us is the potential bifurcation of technology. So we want to ensure that we are not caught, and therefore ensuring that Malaysia and ASEAN is in the geopolitical middle is very important. Thirdly, we want to see Malaysia and ASEAN emerging as a genuine middle class society. Now, why this is relevant? Because for the last many years or many decades, Malaysia, Singapore, ASEAN, and other Asian societies, including China and even sometimes Japan, all these societies became prosperous by exporting to the US and by assuming the US is the consumer of the first and last resort. And therefore, in the export-led industrialization strategy, very often it presupposes suppressing of wages and race to the bottom among ASEAN, ASEAN countries or ASEAN economies. But if we are clear that the third middle is to create a middle class society, then all these equations will have to change. All the assumptions will have to change. Now, if we can create an ASEAN middle class, a genuine middle class in 20 years' time, by 2045, then we can see the world, or we can speak of the world as having US, Europe, the East Asia, and potentially Southeast Asia as a 3.5 global market. Okay, think about this. When China joined WTO, China had about 100 million middle class. Today, by any account, at least 400 million Chinese are considered middle class. So imagine that ASEAN now has 680 million population. By 2045, we may have about 800 million population. Let's say 250 million to 300 million ASEAN population are as rich as Chinese middle class now. That itself will be a very powerful economy and powerful market. So what I'm trying to say is that Malaysia doesn't want to be seen as tilting to anyone. We're very clear that we're not tilting to China. We're very clear that we are holding firm to our geopolitical middle. And this whole idea of staying in the middle, being non-aligned, has been in our DNA. And I think we are clear about it. And what we want to see is that the world will become one that US is still important, but we have a more prosperous Europe, we have a prosperous East Asia, but also a prosperous Southeast Asia.
Okay, so now perhaps we pivot a little bit and we go from sort of very big picture to the other side. We go to personalities. So, can we ask, what are your thoughts on former economy minister Rafizi's resignation and second finance minister Amir Hamza's appointment as joint economy minister, particularly to oversee the finalization of the 13th Malaysia Plan? Will this enhance coordination, as the government is claiming, or is it more of a stopgap measure to delay a cabinet reshuffle?
I think Rafizi's departure from the cabinet is decided, and there's no return as far as Rafizi's departure from the cabinet, and therefore something has to happen. Someone has to take charge. Parliament is going to sit on 21st of July, and the appointment of Amir Hamza as the acting minister for economic affairs, I think, is a good choice. That will help link both the two central agencies, finance and economy, into getting in sync to ensure that the 5-year plan will be coherent and not working in silo.
So maybe also, but then now to broaden it a little bit about and to look forward, because we are at the midpoint of the parliamentary term, and already it's an election year in Sabah, and then there will be a succession of state elections, and then we're wondering about Malaysia's 16th general election. So, well, what can we expect in the second half of the Madani term? More efforts at reform and welfare distribution, or is it more about playing safe and maintaining alliances? And I just want to ask as well, specifically about Ministry of Investment, Trade and Industry. Is there any concern that there will be not enough time for the tangible gains of the policies, right, to really be realized before the next election?
Thank you, Hwok. I think, first of all, this government has stabilized political situation. There is a balance or equilibrium bet- between the forces in Malaysian politics. Secondly, this government has stabilized and also provided clarity on directions as far as the economy is concerned. So as I say, we are getting into the right directions. We'll have the good news. But more importantly, moving into an election cycle. Of course, I don't think that we're entering into the election cycle exactly now. But as you say, we have gone past the first half, and this is now the second half. And once you are in the second half, there's no assurance that when election will happen, and election can happen not at the end of the term, but perhaps maybe closer to the end of the term. I think the government will have to now be very serious about Prime Minister Anwar's Madani framework. The Madani framework put equal emphasis on raising the ceiling and raising the floor. I think this government has been relatively successful in raising the ceiling. We need to do a lot more on raising the floor. I think we have raised the floor to a certain extent, but there needs to be a lot more effort and work on raising the floor, especially when you have an electoral concern in mind. And raising the floor sometimes may require us to rethink what we do and to do it differently. For instance, I think we will have to be very clear that the concern for rising cost of living may not necessarily be the concern about may not necessarily be the cost have risen a lot. It may just be because wages is too low, and we may need a national consensus, a broader consensus among government, businesses, and the other stakeholders to accept that we must increase wages. That is something that I think a national consensus on wages is important. At the same time, in order to deal with raising the floor, dealing with cost of living, maybe it's not so much about cost of living. It's about rethinking development model. For instance, does everyone needs to own a house, right? Should we start thinking about creating more rental housing? Should we sprawl the city or think about building rental housing in inner city without providing car park, without assuming that the residents will drive a car, but providing them housing very close to where they work and where public transport is. When it comes to cost of transport, maybe it's about doing a lot more everywhere as far as public transport is concerned. Now, there are quite a lot of effort that the government has put in improving to improve public transport in major cities, but maybe we need to do a lot more to improve public transport everywhere in the country. So my point is as we enter the next cycle, next half, I think it's about doing a lot more to raise the floor. And raising the floor doesn't necessarily has to come with a very expensive fiscal price tag. I think there's always this debate that the moment you want to raise the floor it's about a heavy price tag from a fiscal point of view. I don't necessarily subscribe to that. I think we need a lot more non-market solutions so that we can delink, for example, housing from market, delink transport from ownership of private car, and through a non-market framework or semi-market framework, we will be able to meet the demand and a demand of a growing population, a population that has more aspiration than ever, and a population that has a lot of potential. So if we can actually do this, I think uh, we'll be on we'll be in a very strong position.
Like I said, you're an optimist, but a constructive one, and I think it's refreshing to hear that. And of course, you've thought through this as well. But these are going to be, of course, long-term challenges. You are also a Reformasi stalwart, and I think one issue weighing heavily these days is direction of reforms. Is it stalling? And it's a very big conversation. But I wanted to get your perspective on a particular angle of it. You are one of the young leaders. You were involved in Verse.
Not very young anymore.
Then you were then the young leader, right? I mean, still young, and a champion of justice and democracy. What is your personal and generational feeling about the reform process? Is there disappointment? Is it lethargy? Is there just sort of a compromise, a sense that this is the new normal? We do a little bit, but the era of thinking big or dreaming big is over.
My generation is a lucky generation. We belong to a generation where we started from nowhere. When I first joined the DAP, Kisiang and Kapasing just lost in the 1999 election. We started at the bottom and we keep progressing. I think this generation of political leaders believe in number one, everything is possible as long as it's feasible. Secondly, we need to be patient to make things happen. Thirdly, the trajectory is correct. We just have to work harder. So I think we have the tenacity, we have the perseverance, we are prepared to work hard and prepared to wait for the long game. I think that if you say that the Reformasi generation, that probably characterize our thinking. The first half of what my political participation was really about trying to create space for a permanent opposition movement. But we won power in 2018, and then we lost power. When I was in government during the Perikatan 1.0 government, in my portfolio, together with others, we created Malaysia's first defense weapon. It is still relevant to the armed forces and to Malaysia's defense posturing. And in my second stint in government, this government, we got a lot more done. We can imagine that we can do a lot more. And potentially, if there's a second term, a lot more could be done. For many, especially many activists in Malaysia, when we were in opposition, many Malaysian opposition activists or NGO activists think in a single item approach. But this is not to fault anyone, because very often in government, government also think in PowerPoint terms. But I think it is time for us to think in a systemic manner. That means we are not there to tick the boxes. We are not there to think of policy making in PowerPoint terms, both those in the government and those in opposition. It's not about PowerPoint. It's not about achieving each point and ticking the boxes. It is about understanding the connectedness of policy making and to bring together different forces and find the best way moving forward. So as far as reform agenda is concerned, I think we need to do more in creating more space in the media, creating more space in parliament, parliamentary debate space, and creating more stable rule-based arrangement for all institutions. Have we done enough? Of course, there is huge room to improve. And to do all this in the era of social media, in the era of potential populism. So this is our challenge on democracy and how to strengthen democracy as well as institutional reform. There are a lot more to be done, but at the same time, I think we have done quite a lot. We need to just do more. But it's not just about democracy, it's about also ensuring that preventing, as I mentioned, preventing sliding of democracy, preventing populism from growing. It is important to look at social economic conditions because as we know, populism rise because of poor social economic conditions. So we will have to tie reform to social economic conditions to ensure that we raise the floor enough and create a middle class so that we secure democracy. Thirdly, we will have to seriously think about security reform as well as our geopolitical standing. It's all tied together. The security sector, police, the armed forces, or other security agencies may have a certain view about how to run security, and there needs to be constant conversation so that we can find a way that the security forces are comfortable in the change with the changes that are introduced by whoever the power that be. At the same time, the security forces are able to comprehend and able to handle the rapidly changing geopolitical situation. So all this, as I say, I spend a bit of time thinking about security sector, and I think tying security sector to institutional reform is important. We have a defense white paper. Therefore, with the defense white paper, it is clear that we are for strengthening of the armed forces, but we also want to ensure that the defense spending are in accordance to plan and not driven by individual wishes. So all this has to come together as a building block. So the building block, I think, is about building a new nationalism or a new nation building process. If we now take all this together and say that this is a Malaysia's second chance, not just in the economic realm, but also a second chance to build a better nation in a world of chaotic changes, then I think Malaysia will be in a good place.
Okay, so could I ask you, or could we ask you a blue sky question? And this goes to institutional reform. So we know that, of course, the Madani administration has a very large parliamentary majority. It's actually the largest since 2004. It's more than two-thirds. This means that it can amend the constitution. So, what would be your one wish list? What could be the one institutional reform that this government could use its supermajority to put into effect? What is your one top deliverable in terms of amending the constitution?
I do not think that this government has the luxury of a supermajority. Whoever thinks that this government has the luxury of a supermajority will face trouble very soon, because this government is a combination of former rivals that comes together. So I think most leaders in this government are conscious of not going on separate agenda too far and too wide, because it is not a supermajority. It is just a combination of forces to create a government that makes sense, make political sense, and a government that can be the building block for a stronger economy and a better nation. So I think as far as any single agenda to amend the constitutions and to change everything, I won't go there. But one thing I think will be in the interest of all forces is to understand federalism with new perspective, and that will fit into the agenda of all forces. In the sense that Malaysia was governed as almost as a centrist or centralized nation for the longest of time. The resources concentrated in the hand of federal government. The sharing, there has been complaint that, especially from the state, the sharing has not been even. But the sharing cannot just be too much of cannibalization. So I hope in the years to come, one of the major conversation among leaders is how we can create a collegial federalism, a federalism in which federal and state could share resources and share taxes. So when the constitutions was formulated in the 50s and 60s, the state control natural resources, yet and federal is given income taxes. During that period of time, it was considered a reasonable deal because Malaysia was yet not yet industrialized, and federal income and state income didn't differ that much. But as we industrialize, federal has a lot more. Of course, as we discover oil, federal had a lot more resources. So how do we have a conversation into the future where the state will be able to enjoy a bit more income taxes collected in their state, while taking on more responsibility. And at the same time, because they have an opportunity to enjoy some taxes, they grow the pie bigger. So my hope is that we can get more leaders to start thinking, imagining a different future, a future in which Malaysia has three or four economic capitals. In the sense that, for instance, in Australia, Western Australia or Perth is the natural resource capital. Melbourne is the second economic capital. And you look at Australia and you know that there are multiple economic regions. All of them eventually add to a larger economy. In Malaysia, I would like to see Johor being seen as, or at least Greater Johor Bahru, being seen as the second economic capital. And people in Kuala Lumpur will be happily seeing some banks eventually set up their HQ in Johor. Some big companies will say, okay, we'll set up in Johor as our HQ, not necessarily in KL. I would like to see more leaders accepting that Penang and Kulim is our technology capital, and we want to see them grow and multiply. We're very happy to see Kuching as the natural resource capital like Perth. So if we can go to that conversation and eventually reach a national consensus on how to manage federal and state relationship into the future, that I think will help to cement a long-term federal state collaboration and a long-term political coalition that will last this government not just one term, but into a new political order.
Okay, thanks for that. Forgive me, I will press you a little bit on the first one. Well, actually, two things. So the first is you began talking about, how it is a coalition of coalitions. You have various actors coming together. So I guess the first question there, in terms of the overall health of the Madani coalition government, is if you could share with us how you see the various coalitions getting on, and in specific, Pakatan Harapan and BN. But then also to go a little bit deeper on your point that you do have different interests. But I wonder sometimes if in Malaysian politics we focus too much on the differences and not enough on the commonalities. So could there not be reforms that are in the interest of everybody, regardless of where they come from? And I think that there's a very interesting discussion that was actually launched by DAP Secretary General Anthony Loke, Minister of Transport, in front of PM Anwar very recently at the conclusion of the DAP National Party Congress when he said that the DAP supports the amendment for a two-term limit for Prime Minister. And I think even in UMNO, there are people that would say that, 22 years in power is quite a long time, probably too much. And even PM Anwar said that he was tired after 2 years. So could this not be the sort of reforms that we can look to, that there could be broad-based support for? And more specifically, what do you think of that idea?
Sure. On your second point, yes, I fully agree that we should look into that and we should achieve that uh, with consensus among the parties, taking into account the experiences of the end of one party state in 2018 and the chaos that happened post 2018 because Malaysia was finding ways and taking advice from a very important statement by the king, the then king, in August 2021, that democracy is about no one winning everything and no other party losing everything. I think that particular royal statement should be the basis for Malaysia to move into the future, where the foundation of democracy in Malaysia is to ensure that no one will lose everything and no one will control everything. And that is in that context, DAP Secretary Anthony Loke spoke about the needs to have constitutional limits to prime ministerial term. And this is already done in Penang. That the Penang Chief Minister has a two-term limit, and I think the Prime Minister received it warmly of Anthony's suggestions, and I think that is a good place to ensure that we build lasting democracy taking the advice of the royal statement back in August 2021. I think that is the foundation for Malaysia to have lasting democracy, so that no, we don't return to the era of prime ministerial dictatorship. I think Prime Minister Anwar is very clear about it, that this is not a prime ministerial dictatorship, and prime minister has to negotiate with all coalition partners because it's a coalition of multi coalitions. Your first question was about the relationship between Barisan Nasional and Pakatan Harapan. Broadly, leaders of UMNO and leaders of Pakatan Harapan in general agree that we should move forward in sync. Exactly what format, we'll have to work it out. Now, if Barisan Nasional and Pakatan Harapan could reach a broad-based agreement into how these two coalitions will enter the 16th January election in Peninsula, and eventually, if the broad-based agreement is that as much as possible, and if possible in every constituency, Barisan Nasional and Pakatan Harapan would not feel a candidate to challenge each other, we are actually reshaping the rule of the game. Because in the 2018 election and the 2022 elections, both general elections saw three corner contests across seats in Peninsula. Now, if the next election we will see one-to-one, what they call a contest in the Peninsula, I think the result will be very clear even before Parliament is dissolved.
Now, crossing the aisle to your parliamentary rivals, Perikatan Nasional, which is the coalition dominated by Malay Party Bersatu and the Islamist Party PAS. What is your take on the coalition now? I think there's been some developments, and we see the opposition leader Hamzah Zainuddin has launched a political platform, but there's also, I think, ongoing elements of getting together and also some unease. But how is the solidity of Perikatan Nasional in your view? And how do you think they will be campaigning heading into the next general election? As you said, could be next year or the year after.
In August 2023, soon after the 60th state elections, I released an article and I say Perikatan Nasional has reached its ceiling. Of course, at that time, many say, "Oh, but Perikatan Nasional has just won many seats in among the states, six states." But what is clear is that the August 2023 state elections was the residual of the Three Kingdom, in which during the 2022 election, there were no single force that was strong enough. There was the collapse of support for Barisan Nasional, and there was contestation between Muhyiddin and Anwar as potential prime minister. So in the 2023 state elections, Perikatan Nasional campaigned on the basis that if Selangor fell, the next week you'll see Anwar falling. The next week you'll see Muhyiddin as prime minister. But after that state election, you cannot continue to sell the idea that Muhyiddin will be the next prime minister, because it's not real. So I think from then on, Perikatan Nasional faced a ceiling. The ceiling is that when Perikatan Nasional is not able to sell the idea that Muhyiddin will be the next prime minister credibly, it is not able to move forward. So the question is, Muhyiddin's leadership is no longer seen as the binding force. Secondly, PAS will have to go through a major debate within the party about its own future. The current PAS leadership and its doctrine came when Fadil Noor Hadi and the Young Turk toppled Asri Muda in the 1982 party conference. So this particular PAS that we see now actually started in October 1982, and it has been there for the last 40 over years with broadly the same framework and the same rhetorics as well as the same ideas or narrative. But this narrative is no longer able to convince the middle ground. There were attempts in history, but that resulted in past splitting and then eventually the formation of Pakatan Harapan, which I won't go into. But the point now is that PAS is at the juncture of what would it do after this. The strength of PAS is still there. There's no doubt. But whether PAS combined with Bersatu can reach the middle, and reaching the middle is where is what would determine an election outcome. That I'm not sure. I'm not sure, and it is whether Perikatan Nasional has the capability to reach the middle in order to convincingly win power in a one-on-one contest. Let's say the next general election is a one-on-one contest, Barisan Nasional and Pakatan Harapan combined versus Perikatan Nasional. In a one-on-one campaign, will Perikatan Nasional has the capability to and also the readiness to come into the middle to take more than 50% of votes and more than 50% of seats. I have a lot of doubts.
So, as we pass the halfway mark of the Madani administration, we're now entering a new electoral cycle. So, looking ahead, we have Sabah later this year, then Malacca late next year, then Sarawak, and then Johor due in 2027. So, Sarawak operates rather differently from the peninsula. But, of course, as you know, Malacca and Johor are really important states for both Pakatan Harapan and Barisan Nasional. So, what are your thoughts about whether these state elections will be held on schedule, that is, before the general election, or whether the general election might be brought forward and held concurrently with either Malacca or Johor?
I have my preferences, but I don't have an answer because it is a prerogative of the Prime Minister to decide when to call an election and for the King to whether to assent to the wishes of the Prime Minister, as well as for the state to decide when to call election. Preferably, as much as possible, I would like to see concurrent election.
So, I guess extending for that, could that mean that then we could be having elections sometime in late 2026?
I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. It all depends on there are so many moving parts. I won't be able to tell you what it will be. I mean, my preference, of course, I hope there will be concurrent elections, but I also there's just too many moving parts. I don't have an answer.
Well, you left us on a bit of a cliffhanger there. But given our topic is Malaysia and even the world in these times of great uncertainty and unpredictability, that's probably quite apt as well. But you've given us so many sharp and incisive insights, and we really appreciate that. And so thank you so much, Chin Tong, for being with us and for joining us on this Fulcrum podcast.
Thank you for joining us in our conversation on Dialogues at Fulcrum. If you want to access more of our analysis on Southeast Asia, please check out fulcrum.sg. Dialogues at Fulcrum is brought to you by the ISIS Yusof Ishak Institute. We look forward to sharing more insightful conversations with you in subsequent episodes. See you then!